Welcome to today's deep dive. We're tackling some pretty fascinating stuff today. Islamic theology.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, we're going to be diving into two major schools of thought, Salafi and Ash'ari.
Right?
You've sent us some really interesting material on this, and we are so excited to unpack it all.
I'm excited to dig in.
Okay, so before we get into the finer points here,
Sure.
can you give us like the quick overview? Let's say someone at a dinner party has heard the terms Salafi and Ash'ari.
Right.
But they don't actually know what they mean.
Okay.
What's your 30-second elevator pitch?
Okay, so I'd say that the Salafis really emphasize returning to the roots of Islam.
Okay.
Like how the Prophet Muhammad and his earliest followers understood and practiced the faith. They're really all about literal interpretations of the Quran and Sunnah.
Okay.
And very cautious about new interpretations or practices that they see as going beyond that.
So it's like if it worked for them, it works for us kind of thing.
Yeah, precisely. And then on the other hand, you have the Ash'aris. They're also deeply rooted in the Quran and Sunnah, but they're a bit more open to incorporating logic and reason as tools to help understand the faith.
So finding that harmony between the traditional teachings and philosophical thought.
That's a great way to put it.
So they're both coming from that place of faith.
They are.
But really using different methods to make sense of it all.
And those different methods lead to some disagreements.
For sure. And this is where it gets really interesting.
It does.
So what's like a big one that really highlights how these different approaches come into play?
I would say one of the biggest is how they define faith itself, or IMAN in Arabic.
Okay.
It's a fundamental thing, right?
It is.
But they have surprisingly different ways of looking at it.
All right. Now you've got me. I'm hooked.
Yeah.
So break it down for me. How do the Salafists view faith?
Okay. So for Salafist faith is active.
Okay.
It's about what you believe in your heart, what you say with your words, and crucially, what you do with your actions.
Okay.
So they believe your level of faith can actually go up or down based on your deeds.
Oh, wow. So it's like a muscle you have to keep exercising.
Exactly.
About that.
Good deeds strengthen your faith and sins weaken it.
Okay. So it's that constant, topping up your faith. I'm guessing the Ash'aris have a different take on this?
Yeah, they do. They see faith more as a state of being.
Okay.
You either have it or you don't. It's primarily rooted in that inner conviction, that firm belief in your heart. Actions are still important to them, but they see good actions as a result of faith.
Okay.
Not something that's going to increase or decrease it.
So less about the topping up.
Yeah.
More about just that core belief driving you to do good.
Exactly.
Okay, I see that.
Yeah.
And to understand these schools of thought even better, who are some of the key thinkers we should be aware of?
All right, so on the Salafi side, you've got someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, a scholar back in the 13th, 14th centuries, and he was a big proponent of this idea of faith being directly tied to action.
Okay, so that's their guy.
Yeah.
And for the Ash'aris?
So for the Ash'aris, one of the most influential scholars was Imam al-Ghazali.
Okay.
He lived around the 11th century, and his writings are still super widely studied today.
Right.
He had a real gift for explaining these really complex theological ideas in a way that people could really grasp.
That's amazing how these debates from centuries ago still carry so much weight.
They do.
Okay, so we've talked about faith. What's another
Right.
major point of contention between the two?
Another big one is how you actually prove God's existence.
Okay.
Can you do it through pure logic, or does it require something a bit more?
Okay.
And again, the Salafists and Ash'aris have very different takes.
Okay, let's unpack that one.
Yeah.
So how do the Salafists tackle this question of proving God?
So they really emphasize, keeping things straightforward. They see Allah's existence as self-evident.
Okay.
So they point to the natural world, the fact that humans seem to have this natural inclination to believe in a higher power. And of course, the Quran itself.
Of course.
As proof.
Okay.
So for them, it's not about needing these elaborate philosophical arguments.
More about intuition and what they see as clear evidence.
Precisely. Now, the Ash'aris, they do appreciate a good logical proof. They even developed a famous one called the Kalam cosmological argument.
Oh, yeah. I think I've heard of that one. I might need a bit of a refresher, though.
Okay, so in a nutshell, it goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. right?
Yeah, it makes sense, yeah.
So the universe, since it did begin to exist, must have a cause.
Okay.
And that cause, according to the Asharis, is Allah.
So it's like the Salafis are kind of trusting the eyewitness account.
Right.
Like, here's the universe that's evidence enough.
Right.
Whereas the Asharis almost want to like break down the evidence,
Exactly.
like gather the clues and build their case.
You've got it. And that difference in approach really plays out in a lot of their theological debates.
Okay, I can see that. So trusting their intuition versus seeking that logical proof.
Exactly.
All right, so you mentioned there were 3 major points of disagreement.
I did.
What's the third one that really sets these schools apart?
The third one gets pretty complex. It's how we even understand God's attributes.
Oh, boy.
Like, how do you describe something that is, by definition, beyond human comprehension?
That's a tough one for sure.
Yeah.
So how do the Salafis approach that?
So, true to form, they stick with the literal interpretations of how God's attributes are described in the Quran.
Okay.
So, for example, when the Quran mentions Allah's hand or face, they take those words literally.
Wait, so they believe that God literally has a hand like ours?
Well, not exactly. It's literal, but with this really important understanding that we as humans can't truly grasp what it means for God to have a hand.
Okay.
So it's not like our human hand. They acknowledge that the true nature of God's attributes is beyond our understanding.
I can see that. It's almost like trying to explain color to someone who's been blind since birth.
It's a good analogy.
So then how do the Asharis approach this?
So the Asharis, they prefer metaphorical interpretations to avoid ascribing human characteristics to God, which is known as anthropomorphism.
Right.
So, for example, that same example of Allah's hand, the Asharis might interpret that as more of a metaphor for God's power or authority.
So it's about finding that interpretation that really emphasizes God's greatness without limiting him to these human-like qualities.
Exactly. And this actually leads to some really interesting discussions.
I can imagine.
Yeah, about how we can even talk about God.
That's fascinating.
Okay,
so we've covered some really interesting differences here between the Salafis and Asharis.
We have.
But even with these disagreements, they're both considered part of Sunni Islam. So what are some of those core beliefs that really unite them under that same umbrella?
So despite those differences, there's a lot of common ground. They both firmly uphold the 6 pillars of Islam, which are considered the foundational practices for Muslims.
Right. So let's do a quick recap for anyone who needs it.
Sure.
What are those 6 pillars again?
Okay, so the 6 pillars of Islam are belief in one God Allah, prayer 5 times a day, fasting during the month of Ramadan, giving to charity, making a pilgrimage to Mecca if you're able to, and believing in the 6 articles of faith, which kind of ties back to that discussion on Iman. So those articles are belief in God, his angels, his revealed books, his messengers, the day of judgment and divine decree.
So those are really the non-negotiables.
Exactly.
The bedrock of the faith.
Yes.
What else ties them together then?
So they both see the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, and the Sunnah, which is the Prophet Muhammad's teachings and way of life, as the ultimate sources of guidance. And they both really stress sticking to those core sources and avoiding what they see as unnecessary innovations.
Although I imagine they might disagree on what counts as an innovation, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's a whole other discussion in and of itself.
Right.
But the point is that they both share that concern about staying true to the heart of Islam as they understand it.
So it's almost like they're trying to follow the same map, but maybe interpreting some of the landmarks differently.
I like that analogy. And to really get into those different interpretations, it helps to kind of dig into the historical context a bit.
Yeah, let's go back in time, set the scene for us. When and where did these schools of thought first emerge?
Okay, so the Salafi movement, as we know it today, really gained traction in the 18th century. Thanks in large part to a scholar named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab.
Okay, is he related at all to the Ibn Taymiyyah that we talked about earlier?
They're not related.
Okay.
But ideologically, Ibn Abd al-Wahhab was very influenced by his writings. He really pushed for this return to a pure form of Islam, one that was really stripped back to the practices of the Prophet and his companions.
So they weren't just debating these abstract points.
Right.
They were really trying to change the way people practice their faith in the real world.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that these debates weren't happening in isolation.
Right.
The Ash'ari school emerged a few centuries earlier, around the 9th and 10th centuries.
Okay.
in a world where Islamic scholars were really grappling with all of these new philosophical ideas, particularly from ancient Greece.
Right. So where did the Ash'aris kind of fit into that picture then?
So they were responding to another group called the Mu'tazila, who were known for their very rationalistic approach to Islam.
Oh, right. Those are the original free thinkers.
Exactly. And they put a lot of emphasis on logic and reason, sometimes even questioning traditional interpretations of the Quran.
Interesting.
So this obviously sparked a lot of debate, and the Ash'ari school kind of emerged as this middle ground.
So bridging that gap between the traditional beliefs and these new ways of thinking.
Precisely. One of the key figures who solidified their influence was Imam al-Ghazali.
Oh, right. Sure.
The same scholar we talked about earlier who had such a way with words.
Right.
He argued that faith and reason weren't mutually exclusive. You could embrace both.
I love that. You don't have to choose.
Right. And he was really influential in making that a mainstream view within Sunni Islam.
Okay.
His writings helped to reconcile traditional thought with all these philosophical ideas that were floating around.
Wow, that's amazing how these debates from so long ago
I know, it's fascinating.
still resonate today.
They do.
Okay, so we've got Ibn Taymiyyah, we've got Imam al-Ghazali,
Yes.
Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. Any other key figures
Oh, yeah.
we should be aware of?
Well, we can't talk about the Ash'ari school without mentioning the founder, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari himself.
Okay.
He was a fascinating figure who actually started out as a follower of the Mu'tazila school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he actually switched sides.
There's a plot twist. So what happened? How did he go from Mu'tazila to Ash'ari?
Well, the story goes that he had a bit of a theological crisis.
Okay.
He started to feel like the Mu'tazila's emphasis on reason was leading them away from the core principles of Islam.
Okay.
So he broke away and developed his own system of thought that tried to find that balance between revelation and rational thought.
So he was really seeking that middle ground.
Yeah, his ideas formed the foundation for the Ash'ari school and went on to have a massive influence on Sunni theology.
It's really amazing to see how these debates have really shaped centuries of thought.
They really have.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
It's really like taking a crash course.
It is.
In Islamic thought.
Yeah.
As we kind of dig deeper into the differences between these two schools, I think it would be really helpful to get some concrete examples.
Okay.
Like how would a Salafi and an Ash'ari approach a modern issue like, say, bioethics differently?
That's a great question, because it really gets to the heart of how these theological differences play out
Exactly.
in real life.
Yeah.
So let's take the example of genetic engineering,
Okay.
which raises all sorts of ethical questions.
Absolutely. So we've got a Salafi and an Ash'ari thinking about gene editing.
Right.
Where do they diverge? Where do their approaches differ?
So a Salafi, with their emphasis on a literal understanding of the Quran and that reverence for God's creation as it is, might be more inclined to view genetic manipulation as overstepping human bounds.
So not playing God, essentially.
Exactly. They might argue that we should trust in Allah's wisdom and not try to interfere.
Right. And that makes total sense given everything that we've talked about.
It does.
So how about the Ash'ari perspective on something like that?
An Ash'ari, while still deeply devout, might be more open to exploring the potential benefits of genetic engineering, particularly if it could alleviate suffering.
Right.
So they would likely approach it from a place of reason, weighing those potential risks and rewards.
So it's not as easy as saying all Salafis believe this or all Ash'aris believe that.
Exactly. And that's something I hope listeners really take away from this, that there's so much diversity of thought within Islam.
Right.
It's a religion with over 1 billion followers, so it would be impossible for them to see eye to eye on every single issue.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder for all of us, I think, to never make assumptions.
Absolutely.
About entire groups of people.
Every individual brings their own experiences and interpretations to the table.
And the more we can understand those nuances, the richer our understanding of the world becomes.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've got a much richer understanding of Islamic theology today.
I hope so.
Before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think the key takeaway here is that, exploring these different schools of thought, even within a religious tradition, it doesn't diminish faith. It enriches it.
I love that.
It shows us that there are multiple ways of approaching these big questions, and that grappling with these questions is a journey, not a destination.
Beautifully put.
Thank you.
And I love that you've left us with more to think about.
Right.
So if you had to pick a side, which of these schools, Salafi or Ash'ari, really resonates most with your approach to faith and reason and why?
Ooh, that's a great question, and it's one I'm going to turn back to the listeners on that one.
I love that. That's what this is all about.
Yeah.
We're diving deep.
We are.
Sparking that curiosity.
Yes.
And hopefully leaving you with even more questions to ponder.
For sure.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of Islamic theology.
Thank you. You're right. There are those really interesting differences, but with all of that, there is a lot of common ground.
Yep.
They both really firmly believe in and uphold the 6 pillars of Islam, which are like the foundational practices for Muslims.
Right. So let's super quick recap for anyone who might need it.
Okay.
What are the 6 pillars again?
So the 6 pillars of Islam are belief in one God Allah, prayer 5 times a day, fasting during the month of Ramadan, giving to charity, making a pilgrimage to Mecca if you're able,
right,
and believing in those 6 articles of faith,
okay,
which kind of ties back into our whole discussion on Iman.
Right.
So belief in God, his angels, his revealed books, his messengers,
okay,
the day of judgment and divine decree.
Okay, so those are like really
Yes.
the non-negotiables, the bedrock of it all.
Exactly.
What else ties them together?
So they both view the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, and the Sunnah, which is the Prophet Muhammad's teachings and way of life,
Right.
as like the ultimate sources of guidance.
Okay.
And they both really stress sticking to those core sources and avoiding what they see as unnecessary innovations.
Although I'd imagine they might even disagree on what counts as an innovation.
Oh, absolutely. That's a whole other conversation
Right.
in and of itself.
For sure.
But the main thing is they share that concern about staying true to the heart of Islam as they understand it.
Yeah. So almost like they're trying to follow the same map, but maybe interpreting some of those landmarks differently.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And to really understand those different interpretations, we have to go back in time a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's set the scene. When and where did these schools of thought first emerge?
So the Salafi movement, as we know it today, it really gained a lot of traction back in the 18th century.
Okay.
Thanks largely to a scholar named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab.
Now, is he at all related to the Ibn Taymiyyah we talked about earlier?
They're not related, no.
Okay.
But ideologically, Ibn Abd al-Wahhab was very influenced by his writings.
Okay.
He really pushed for a return to what he saw as this pure form of Islam, like really stripped back to the practices of the Prophet and his companions.
So it wasn't just about debating these abstract theological points.
Right.
They were really trying to change how people practice their faith.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to remember that these debates weren't happening in isolation.
Right.
The Ash'ari school emerged a few centuries earlier, around the 9th and 10th centuries, in a world where Islamic scholars were really grappling with all these new philosophical ideas,
Right.
especially from ancient Greece. So where did the Ash'aris fit into that picture?
Right.
Well, they were responding to another group called the Mu'tazila,
Okay.
who were really known for this super rationalistic approach to Islam.
Those are like the original free thinkers we talked about.
Exactly. And they put a ton of emphasis on logic and reason, sometimes even going so far as to question traditional interpretations
Interesting.
of the Quran.
Okay.
This obviously caused a lot of debate,
Right.
and the Ash'ari school kind of emerged as this middle ground.
So bridging that gap between the traditional beliefs
Yeah.
and these new ways of thinking.
Exactly. And one of the key figures who solidified their influence was Imam al-Ghazali,
Right. Okay.
we talked about earlier, who really had that way with words.
Yeah.
He argued that faith and reason, they weren't mutually exclusive. You could embrace both.
I love that idea. You don't have to choose.
Right. And he was super influential in making that mainstream within Sunni Islam.
Okay.
His writing really helped to kind of reconcile that traditional thought with all these philosophical ideas.
That's amazing how these debates from so long ago still resonate today.
I know, it's fascinating.
Okay, so we've got Ibn Taymiyyah, Imam al-Ghazali, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. Are there any other, like, major figures we should know about?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
We can't talk about the Ash'ari school without talking about the founder,
Right.
Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari himself.
Okay.
He was a super interesting guy who actually started out as a follower of the Mu'tazila school.
Oh, wow, really?
He did.
So he switched sides.
He did.
How did that happen? How do you go from Mu'tazila to Ash'ari?
So the story goes that he had a bit of a theological crisis.
Okay.
He started to feel like that emphasis on reason was leading them too far away from the core of Islam.
Interesting.
So he broke away and kind of developed his own system of thought. It really tried to balance revelation and reason.
So again, finding that middle ground.
Yeah. And his ideas went on to have a massive influence on Sunni theology.
It's just incredible to me how these debates have shaped centuries of thought.
They really have.
We've covered so much ground today.
Right? It's a lot.
It's like a crash course
It is.
in Islamic thought.
Yeah.
But as we kind of dig deeper into these differences between the schools, I think it would be really helpful to get some more concrete examples.
Okay.
Like, how would a Salafi and an Ash'ari approach a modern issue, like, say, bioethics differently?
That is a great question.
Yeah.
Because it really gets at how these theological differences actually play out
Exactly.
in the real world.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really gets at, I think, how these theological debates actually have real world implications.
For sure.
Let's take genetic engineering, for example.
Okay.
Which is a topic that brings up all sorts of ethical questions for people.
Totally. So we've got a Salafi and an Ash'ari, and they're both thinking about gene editing.
Right.
Where do their paths diverge?
So a Salafi with that emphasis on the literal understanding of the Quran and that reverence for God's creation as it is might be more likely to see genetic manipulation as overstepping,
Yeah.
human bound.
Like playing God a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They might say we should just trust in Allah's wisdom and not try to, mess with things too much.
Which makes sense given everything we've talked about.
Right.
Okay, so how about the Ash'ari perspective then?
An Ash'ari, while still being, deeply devout,
Right.
might be a bit more open to thinking about the good things that could come from it.
Okay.
If it could alleviate suffering,
Right.
they'd probably come at it from a place of reason, weighing the risks and the benefits.
Right. So it's not as simple as saying
Right.
all Salafis believe this and all Ash'aris believe that.
Exactly. And that's something I really hope listeners take away from all this, that there's just so much diversity of thought
Yeah.
within Islam. I mean, it's a religion with over 1 billion people. There's no way they're all going to agree on everything.
That's a good point. It's like a good reminder for us, I think, to never make assumptions about a whole group of people.
Absolutely. Everyone brings their own experiences and understanding to the table.
And the more that we can kind of understand those nuances,
Yeah.
the richer our understanding of everything really becomes.
100%.
Well, I think we definitely got a much richer understanding of Islamic theology today.
I hope so.
Before we wrap up, though, are there any final thoughts you wanted to leave our listeners with?
I think the big takeaway here is that learning about these different schools of thought, even within a religious tradition like this, it doesn't take away from faith. It just makes it richer.
Yeah.
It shows us there are many different ways of approaching the divine.
Yeah.
And that thinking about these questions is a journey and it doesn't really end.
That's beautifully put.
Thank you.
And I love that you've left us with even more to think about.
Of course.
Even after the episode is over. So if you had to choose just one, though, Salafi or Ash'ari, which one kind of resonates more with your own approach to faith and reason?
Ooh, that is a tough one. I'm going to have to throw that back to the listeners on that one.
I love that. That's what we do here.
Right.
We dive deep.
We do.
We spark the curiosity.
Absolutely.
And hopefully leave you with even more to think about.
So much to ponder.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into Islamic theology.
Thank you.
This was awesome.